Praised be Jesus Christ, both now and forever. Thank you for the kind welcome that you gave me this morning. Even though I used to be your neighbor up the street in Nampa for a long time, I was always busy on Sunday and couldn't get here at a parish. And thank you to Father Manuel and Father Vitalis for their warm welcome. And I just want to say, gosh, God bless you all, and thank you as you've welcomed new priests into your parish. Transition can oftentimes be difficult, and I know we all grow to love our pastors most of the time. Saying I was a pastor. No, and to transition from Father Len and Father John, who you've had for a long time. So just thank you, and thanks for welcoming these new priests, and just appreciate your willingness to do what I don't think most people would do. To leave your homeland to serve the church. And that's pretty amazing to think about it. Say, I'm going to leave everything that's near and dear and familiar to me for the sake of Jesus. Like that's pretty awesome. I haven't done that. And so I thank you and the many other priests who have come to serve in our diocese. We have been so blessed to be listening to the 6th chapter of John's Gospel these last 6 weeks. This chapter on the Eucharist. I would like to do a little Bible study this morning. Is that okay? Now, if you don't want to do the Bible study, you can just close your eyes and pretend you're praying and take a little nap, and I'll wake up in a little bit. I believe that St. John the Apostle is doing something very intentional and very profound in his gospel. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and each of them are trying to do something specific in their gospel. And John, that young apostle who was with Jesus at every important moment. It was always Peter, James, and John went with Jesus. And it was John who stood at the cross as Jesus died. It was John who took Mary, the Blessed Mother, to live with him. And he wrote this. And he's trying to tell us something really important. And I would like to break that open to you in a little bit, in a way, because I'm not John, but I'll try to do that this morning. We know that Jesus' public ministry was how long? 3 years. And we know that from the Gospel of John. Because in John's Gospel, Jesus celebrates the Passover 3 times. Thank you very much. Now you know that, huh? So there are 3 Passovers, 3 years in John's Gospel. And at each of these Passovers, Jesus does something incredible. And I want us to walk through those 3 Passovers, and I can do it pretty quick. Because it's in that moment, Jesus is lining up his purpose and what he's intending to do. You with me? The first Passover happens in John chapter 2, and it's the cleansing of the temple. Do you remember that story? So it says in John chapter 2, and it was the Passover, and Jesus walks in with his newly recruited disciples, and he walks into the temple, and you know the story. He just begins to cause chaos. He's kicking over tables, all the animals are running, he's making a whip of cords, and his disciples are thinking, what are we doing here? Like, what just happened? Now, what's fascinating is he just walked into the Passover season temple and did that. Can you imagine midnight mass, someone walking up here and knocking over the Christmas tree? And this is the kind of what he's doing. Now, if it happened here, we would side tackle him, call the cops, and he'd be in chains. But they didn't do that to Jesus. In John's Gospel, when Jesus does that, the leaders stand up and they say, what sign can you give us for doing what you have done? In other words, they knew their scriptures, and the prophets had long been speaking that when the Messiah comes, he's going to cleanse the temple. And no one had ever done something so bold. And so when he comes in, he does that. They were all reflecting on the prophets, and they were thinking, maybe this is the one. So what sign can you give us then for doing this? And he stands up and he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And they look at him and they think, this temple has taken decades to build, and you're going to restore it in 3 days? And then in the gospel, John puts a parenthesis for you and me to read, and it says, but he was speaking about the temple of his body. And so when he rose from the dead, his disciples remembered he had said this, and they believed in him. He wasn't talking about that temple. He was referring to himself. Jesus on that Passover was coming in and he was saying boldly, I am the new temple. This temple is the place where the Holy of Holies dwells. It's where divinity and humanity meet. I am now the place where divinity and humanity meet. This is the place where sacrifice happens. I am now the place where sacrifice happens. You come here for your prayers to be heard. I am the place where your prayers will be heard. I am the place of communion. I am the place of intimacy with God. It's me. I'm not saying they understood that, but they did later. And that's what he was saying. And he did it on a Passover, because that's the great feast of the Jews, when God set his people free from slavery and brought them to the promised land. And that's the great template. God is going to set us free from slavery to sin and bring us to the promised land of heaven, right? And so that context of Passover is key. And also, Jesus does these things on the Passover because when something big happens on a holiday, you never forget it, don't you, huh? That's why, like, every time for Thanksgiving, you get together and you know exactly what happened last Thanksgiving, the Thanksgiving before, and what your crazy uncle did, and all that kind of stuff. That's why it's also so difficult when a tragedy happens on a holiday, you never forget. So Jesus wants to imprint in his disciples this moment. That's the first Passover. Jesus proclaiming himself to be the new temple, the place of worship. A year goes by, and 4 chapters go by in John's gospel. John chapter 6, which we've been breaking open for 6 weeks now, is the bread of life discourse. And at the beginning, you might not have noticed that, but when Jesus, just before he multiplied the loaves and fish, it said, and the feast of Passover was near. So I'm sure disciples were thinking, gosh, last year that was pretty crazy at the temple. I wonder what Jesus is going to do this year. And now he didn't just have a handful of newly recruited disciples. There are thousands of potential disciples in front of him. People who've been following him, seeing his miracles. And they're called disciples. Disciples are people who are really convinced, but not totally sure. And they're following Jesus. And you know the story. They were all out there, and Jesus said to his disciples, go feed them. And they're like, yeah, that's a good one, Jesus. No, I'm serious. Go feed them. Jesus could be playful, but at this moment he wasn't. The disciples knew he was being very serious. The intention of Jesus for his church is that the church would feed his people. Now go feed them. And they begin to look around, and all they find are 5 loaves and 2 fish, but what good are these for so many? No. The disciples need to learn to stop thinking like that. Jesus is capable of doing anything. We just have to bring what we have and stop thinking, oh, I don't have enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not enough of this. I'm too little of that. Stop. It's not about you. It's about what Jesus is capable of accomplishing through you. You just have to bring whatever you have to him and submit it to his divine authority and grace, and he will work miracles. So disciples, feed them. This isn't about you. And they go. And then he says, now go pick up the leftovers. And do you remember how many baskets they filled? 12. How many apostles? 12. An important lesson that they took home that day. Wow. And that night, they went across the water to the other side. In the morning, the people woke up and they were like, man, where'd they go? And they ran around to the other side. And that's where John chapter 6 really begins, is they meet him on the other side. And they're like, hey, Jesus, how'd you get here? And Jesus says to them, I know why you're here. You're not here because you saw the signs, but because you ate the loaves and were filled. In other words, you're not here because you think I'm the Messiah and you were convinced by that miracle. You're here because I'm your lunch ticket. You like free lunch, don't you? And we all know putting food on our tables is a big task, isn't it? And in the ancient world, it consumed all of your time. And to have a man who could just miraculously, he'd be like a walking pantry, I'm going to follow him. And he says, no, that's not me. Do not work for food that perishes. Work for the food that endures for eternal life. I am the bread of life. I'm not your pantry. I'm not your miracle ATM machine. I am the I am. And I've come to impart divine grace into you, that every single one of us could become a son and daughter of God. In fact, that's the purpose of Jesus, is to put his life in us, miraculously, powerfully, gracefully, and that we would become like him. And he goes on to say in all of John chapter 6, but these priests, I'm sure, have already told you all about that, so I'm not going to get into that. And he speaks very clearly about the Eucharist, that the Eucharist is going to be the means in which Jesus is going to share his powerful divine event of salvation on the cross with us. That when he died on the cross, something powerful happened. And the way that you and I get into contact with that saving event and grace is through the Eucharist. And as we heard today, the people were struggling with that. And many of them didn't believe it. And he says, my flesh is real food, my blood is real drink. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you won't have life in you. You know all this. And today, did you hear it? Right at the beginning of the readings. Oh, it's so sad. They said to Jesus, this saying is hard. Who can accept it? And then Jesus says to them, are you going to accept it or not? And as a result of this, many of his disciples returned to the former way of life and didn't walk with Jesus anymore. They left. Now, I don't get too crazy into like numbers and things, but you know the number of the beast, the number of Satan in Revelation, do you know what number that is? 666. Do you know what John chapter 6, verse 66 is? As a result of this, many of his disciples returned to their former way of life and no longer accompanied him. That's John 6:6. Leaving Jesus. Walking away from him. Interesting, huh? That's the second Passover, though. The disciples now have experienced this great miracle, and Jesus going on and on about the Eucharist, and they didn't fully understand it, but there it is. That's the second Passover. A year goes by. You ready? John chapter 13, the Last Supper. And in this context, Jesus with the 12, he's preparing now for his death and resurrection. This is the culmination now of his ministry. And Jesus, knowing what he's going to do now, he gathers the 12, and the first thing he does is he washes their feet. He institutes the sacrament of holy orders. That's what the washing of the feet is. It's the ordination of those 12 men. That's what it is. Every Holy Thursday, we remember this, don't we, in great detail. Holy Thursday, the washing of the feet and the Lord's Supper, the institution of the sacraments of holy orders and Holy Eucharist. Now, bishops today, when we were ordained, they put their hands on our heads, but Jesus washed their feet. I think they wanted them to understand that priesthood is rooted in profound service and charity. And Jesus, if he's a new temple, if he's the new temple, then he needs a new priesthood. Not rooted in the old priesthood, but a new one. Because it's going to be a new sacrifice, that sacrifice. And it's going to be in Jesus that we now are going to find our freedom. And so there's going to be a new priesthood. And so he institutes that priesthood at the Last Supper. So now he has his priest ready. And then you know what happens. In the context of the Last Supper, he takes the bread. And he says the words that I'm going to say verbatim in just a few moments. Take this, all of you, and eat it. For this is my body, which will be given up for you. And his apostles must have been going, oh my God. It's exactly what he said last year. Take this. This is the cup of my blood. The blood of the new and eternal covenant, which will be shed for you, many. Wrapping up, your nap's almost over. 3 Passovers. If each of those Passovers were a lens, like in a lens in a telescope, take John chapter 2, the cleansing of the temple, Christ proclaiming himself to be the new place of worship and intimacy with God. That's a lens that you're going to look through. You take John chapter 6, the bread of life discourse, the Eucharist being the way God will transmit his saving grace, this necessary this necessary sustenance for us to become sons of God. Put that there. Now you have two lenses to look through. Then John chapter 13, the Last Supper, the institution of holy orders and holy Eucharist, Jesus' death and resurrection. You place those three lenses together and you look through them. Do you know what you will see? What's right in front of you. It's the Mass. It's the Mass. That's what St. John is telling us. This is how we encounter the risen Lord. This is where we're fed with the bread of angels. This is where we're strengthened and to go and feed the poor and love our neighbor and do all those things. It's here. This is the gift. Now, I don't know what that means to you, but I think you should spend some time thinking about that.